Good morning, everybody. My name is Jim Mayer, and I'm Executive Director of California Forward. Throughout California Forward's journey, we've found an incredible number of very smart and insightful Californians who have great wisdom about what's wrong with our state and what it would take to make it a better state. And today we're joined with Larry Gerston, who's one of those Californians who's been thinking a lot about what's gone wrong and what needs to happen for it to go right. Larry is a professor at San Jose State University in political science, where he's training the next set of thinkers and political leaders and others that want to study science, political science, in order to make a difference in the world. Clearly one of our challenges is these problems really are complex. Right? It's a combination of things that are working or not working in the public sector and government, things that are changing dramatically in the private sector and the global economy in particular, as well as, you say, this overlay of who are Californians and how have they changed. As you had the luxury of thinking that through, how do you start to unravel that? What to you are the most important issues for people to start thinking about?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, one, obviously, are fiscal issues here. It isn't just how much money we have in a pot, whether it's Sacramento or local government. It's where you get that money. It's how you derive that money. We're in a situation now where 62% of the general fund is generated through the income tax. Well, that's fine when the economy goes well and everyone's making a lot of money. Not so fine when the economy dips and suddenly we find ourselves with 12-13% unemployment. That just doesn't work. So we need to think about our revenue sources, distributing them in a way where we'll get more from different pots, if you will. And we have so many interest groups in Sacramento and other places that have protected their own turf, and in the process really kept the state from moving through. So I think we have all these kinds of revenue issues. You can't spend what you don't have. Right. And clearly we've got what most people believe is a $20 billion structural deficit every year, in and out. We have to come up with ways in which everyone plays a part, everyone has some skin in the game, everyone has some responsibility, for making this state run right. You just can't put it on the shoulders of a few. And some of that has to do with the very nature of our economy. We no longer are a manufacturing economy. We're much more a service economy. And yet the fact is that only about 40% of those services that might be eligible for the sales tax are actually done so. You don't pay sales tax at dry cleaners. You don't pay sales tax at your attorney, at your doctor. You don't pay sales tax when you go ahead and get your car repaired, except for the parts. Well, things are different now, and so this state, this 21st century state, is operating with really a combination of a 19th and 20th century economic mentality. It doesn't work anymore, and we have to come to terms with that. Then there's a whole other issue about the way that the state's political system works. This too is way out of date, if you will. Think of all the inefficiencies we have there with multiple fire departments, multiple police departments, cities that are so small, all operating independently. And it's wonderful for people who say, this is my mayor, this is my police chief. That all costs a lot of money through overlap, through inefficiencies. We have to think differently. And that goes all the way up to the state, all the way up.
Sometimes people, as they talk through this issue, they like to point to one problem or one issue. They say it's Prop 13 or it's this or that. And I've always been a little challenged by that because, as you point out, it's very complex and there's a variety of causes that lead to this dysfunction. But what I also hear you saying is that we just haven't evolved as this state has gotten more complex, more big in terms of population or diversity of that population or the economy. How do we put in place a governance system that adapts, that becomes more efficient, more performance oriented, without having to have dramatic lurches in the Constitution?
We have to start, I think, with the principle that there are no sacred cows. There are no sacred cows. That's enough right there. Okay? Because everybody, as I said, is protecting their turf. But if we can really say there are no sacred cows, all of us have to think about what can be done better and have that honest conversation. There are so many things we can do. Some of them are not that hard. The old idea of having a state controller, a state treasurer, a board of equalization, this is nuts. It just doesn't work that way anymore. They all overlap with one another. We need to think about how to do things better. And in doing them better, they'll be more efficient. And if they're more efficient, people will see more about what's going on and probably be more invested.
So what do you think the incumbents in those positions need to hear? What, because as you talk about sacred cows, what came to mind, Larry, was the public has its sacred cows and the politicians have their sacred cows, and they're different herds. And so it seems to me that as you start thinking this through, it's how do you start that conversation among the elected or appointed people that are holding those positions of power, and what do they need to know about what's going on in the public sphere?
I look at it the opposite way. I think the conversation has to start with the people. We have an incredibly uneducated society. It shows on the test scores. We score near the bottom in math, in science, in reading, near the bottom. It shows in how much money we spend for public education, ranking 48th. We're sacrificing literally an entire generation. The first place we need to do is start there. We need to educate our kids and make them aware of what their needs are and how to go about doing them. We need to show our kids how they can be more demanding of those we put in office. The people we elect will do what they think is right unless they are pushed otherwise. But unless we push from the bottom, I mean really push from the bottom, in ways that people just don't think about, then we're not going to get there.
That's been our experience, that when we engage Californians on how are you going to finance community services, what does government do for you, and how are we going to pay for it? If we could start from a blank slate, what would it look like? And then how do we adapt what we've got to get there? It's a much more fruitful conversation. And if we could get that going, how then do we engage some of those interest groups that can have tendency to control the agenda in the Capitol? There's groups that can stop any conversation around taxation pretty darn quick. And then there's other groups that want to talk about taxes regardless of where the money's going to go or what good it's going to do.
Here's where a little self-interest doesn't hurt. They need to understand that with a decaying California, they're not going to be able to sell as much product. They need to understand that if they don't have an educated workforce, they can't have people working for them. And if they outsource or offshore, it's not always a pleasant experience. There are downsides to that too. We've seen already examples of some companies that have come back because the chain along the way, the food chain, was so difficult to maintain. So there are lots of issues here, but companies particularly need to understand that it's in their interest. It's not all about profit, especially if you're losing your customer base. And we know that a lot of people in this state are leaving on either end. They're leaving because they can't get a job at all, so they're going to places like Texas, that now ranks highest with Mississippi in the largest number of minimum wage jobs. Those are the jobs that get in Texas from Californians who have no skills, or the businesses are going offshore for people who have engineering and computer sciences that we don't provide enough of here. Again, it gets back to investment.
When you talk to Californians about what investments we need, whether to make ourselves economically competitive or to educate our children to be successful, they're all there. They seem to be willing to want to do that. But then when you ask them about a specific proposal, there's a tremendous amount of distrust that the money won't be well spent.
There's a great deal of cynicism, not only here, but across the country. Probably more here, but everywhere. Look, a lot of this has to do with our declining standard of living. People are frustrated over a declining standard of living. The middle class is dropping out. The haves are doing just fine, thank you, and they'll continue to do fine. They won't worry about voting for more sales taxes or parcel taxes because they're in a gated community. They won't worry about voting for education money because they're sending their kids to private school or they live in a very wealthy city. The have-nots in the middle, those are the guys who are falling further and further behind. And as that gap grows, it leaves people more and more unhappy. So we really have to be honest about some of this stuff, and we can overcome a lot of this. We don't have to have a declining standard of living if we're willing to invest.
Larry, you said governance reform or fixing the state was going to require the public getting engaged, getting informed, and putting pressure on public officials in order to make the hard choices to go forward. And that's I think sound, because that's how democracies actually work. At the same time, when we look back at when we've been in trouble, we've also had mostly elected leaders that have realized they've got to lead some of this as well. That it seems like part of this calculus has got to be people who are willing to stake out an agenda for change, a process that's inclusive, that's visionary, that can actually lead the public as well as respond to their desire for this kind of change. Do you agree with that? And if so, do you see anything on the horizon that looks like the kind of political backbone that it would take to move us in the right direction?
Starting to see some things coming from Jerry Brown, I think, that are very interesting. Very interesting. And you know, people can debate their worth, their value. But I find it interesting that, like his father, who proposed the great water system for California. I mean, the program that Pat Brown proposed in 1959, I believe it was $1.7 billion. That was the size of the state budget. Mm-hmm. Well, how far away is that from high-speed rail? Mm-hmm. About the size of the state budget. Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting. These things are 20, 30 years in the making. They're visionary. Mm-hmm. They're visionary. They're trying to prepare for California 50 years from now, instead of trying to get out of the mess we're in from the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. They're looking ahead. Whatever you think about the peripheral tunnel idea, it's visionary. Mm-hmm. It's visionary. And I think people can debate these things and decide whether they're worth it or whether they're not. But those big ideas, I think, are the kinds of things that will help us, at least partially, see our way out of this forest. Because until we're ready to take things on, and again, put our arms around them, it's going to be hard. We can't get out of things in onesie-twosie steps.
And one of the things that people have observed was there was a time where getting 2/3 agreement in the legislature wasn't that hard. And so the other side of whether or not the rules should change is, have we become more divided, and more divided in ways where elected leaders can't drive that kind of compromise solution. And we've seen some changes intended to reduce that stalemate, whether it's the top 2 primary or the Citizens Redistricting Commission, and we'll see whether or how well they work to do that. But do you agree with that assessment, that we've become more divided, and that the partisan gridlock there is preventing us from reaching conclusions that we might otherwise have reached?
I do, and I think it gets back to what's happening with the haves and the have-nots. The haves need to protect what they have, and the have-nots are clamoring for change. And you don't have to have a lot of haves to control the process. Mm-hmm. So yeah, look, as this pie in California, this economic pie, gets more and more fragile, as more jobs are on the line, people are in a state of, if not panic, near panic about their future. You know, they're worried. And so the status quo interests are very concerned about making sure that things continue the way they have, because they've been fine for us. And the others are pushing for some sort of change but don't have any power or capability to do it. That polarization is increasing as the economic vitality of this state gets sapped.
So the partisan ideological gaps get reinforced by the economic gaps.
The economic gaps actually fuel the partisan gaps, in my judgment. The distances, the needs, they're great. And the more we are unable to address them, the greater they grow. The greater they grow apart.
And who can bridge that gap?
Well, this is a big question, isn't it? Who can bridge this gap? We all can bridge this gap, I think. We all and must. But it's the kind of thing that until people realize the costs that are at stake, as I say, sacrificing a generation. Mm-hmm. Do you realize that more than half of all high school students admitted to CSU must take remedial reading or remedial math? Those are the ones who graduated. Right. And remember, a quarter never graduate. And where did they wind up? Not as CEOs. Mm-hmm. They wind up in prison, where we're all too willing to spend $50,000 a person. These are all the pieces. Mm-hmm. These are the many pieces, only some of them really, that we must get our arms around to see whatever benefits we think we're saving, mm-hmm. the costs are tremendous.
What I don't think most people understand is there's essentially a war going on among those local governments as well. I mean, one of the strongest tensions we have inside baseball is between local governments and the state. And the state taking money from the local governments, and the local governments trying to put things into the Constitution to protect their revenue. And so you would expect, if we're going to get to goal on any of these things, the big picture things you've been describing, government's going to have to work together. It may not be kumbaya, but we can't be burning half of our daily energy fighting among ourselves. Yeah. And yet, so some of this to me is about an inefficiency, but the real challenge is not only are we inefficient, but we're spending a tremendous amount of energy among governments being very distrustful and trying to protect turf rather than working together to educate kids, build community, build economic conditions that will drive private investment?
Yeah, there are a couple of things here. One, it's funny, you know the old story, the crisis is an opportunity every time. And what we're seeing in San Mateo County, of all places, is a number of local governments realizing, you know what, we can't afford this police force, we're going to use a sheriff's department. We must merge our fire departments because we just can't afford to keep these things by themselves. And that's done simply because they're out of money. Okay, that's what it took, fabulous. Mm-hmm. So that's one place where we're seeing the very, very beginnings of some thoughtful ideas here in terms of blending services to save money, to provide more services because you've saved money because you've been efficient. The other thing is, as you mentioned, we've got to come up with a way to straighten out the relationship between the state and local governments. It's gone amok. There's no doubt about it that local governments do things the state can't do. That's all there is to it. And the state does things that local governments can't do.
That's right.
We have to come up with a way not just to decide who's going to do what, but everyone has to have a revenue source or sources to do what they need to do. Mm-hmm. That's a good news, bad news thing. The good news is the more local governments have their own pots, so to speak, to draw from, the better off they'll be in taking care of the needs of their citizens, generated by their citizens, etc. It's a close relationship, we know that. The bad news is that some local governments will be much wealthier than others, and so there's the potential for disparity. Somewhere we have to find a way to deal with that, where there are enough funds at local governments, but not to the point where the disparities are such that we continue the kind of the have-nots existence in California. That won't work in the long run. It's complicated.
Yeah. You know, that I certainly have seen as we travel around the state that there are these places in local governments because of the fiscal crisis or because the state is defaulting to local governments, either through budget cuts, they're just not funding it anymore, or they're actually shifting the responsibility through realignment, that local governments are having to rise to the occasion. And some are ready and more capable and willing and able, and others are not ready to lead. And so we're seeing, in many ways, a devolution. Unsure yet whether it will be an evolution that results in more efficient, effective services. Clearly, in some places it will. But as you point out, then we're going to have a new kind of inequity to deal with. And it seems if you look back over the last generation, that we had a whole bunch of disparities. We were making progress on the economic disparity, but that seems to have been eroding dramatically in the last few years.
We were addressing those things, as you said, years ago. It was easier. If you think about the way the state unfolded, in 1980 we were less than about 10% of the population. We were getting 22% of the defense dollars. Wow! Everybody was working at a good job. Right. We were producing automobiles here. We were doing all kinds of things. You know, this was a manufacturing juggernaut. All that's changed. It's changed nationally, but it's changed even more here. So whereas we were always working with an expanding pie, that pie has now changed. It's not expanding anymore in the same way. We can make it expand. We are just the home of R&D. We can do things here that nobody else does. The venture capital flows into California, particularly Silicon Valley. But we have to start thinking that way. It gets back to training our kids so that they can do those good jobs. There are answers if we're all willing to contribute and step up. And that's part of why business has to realize it's in its self-interest too to make this a better place.
What's the narrative we need for the state of California? Beyond a tunnel under the Delta and a train that some people want and some people don't. Those are very visionary, physical things we can point to. But what's the narrative that you think we need to be putting in place so people can start rallying around a vision and then having these difficult conversations about who's going to pay taxes and how we're going to jumpstart the economy and how we're going to fix education so our kids can read and write?
It sounds almost like a disconnect, but I would put it this way. It's in our self-interest to work for the collective good. Because if we work for the collective good, most of us are going to come out a lot more ahead than we ever would have. But to do that, that means we have to be willing to do something that we are not good at, and that's sacrifice. We have to be willing to know that at least short term, maybe 5, 10, 15 years, I don't know longer, we're going to have to put in more than it seems like we're getting out. But to know downstream we'll be getting out much more than we ever imagined. That's the kind of thing that we need to think about. To me, that's the most important of all conversations, and that's the one people don't like to have, which makes me think that's all the more reason we need to have it.
Do you think it's too late? Do you think we can turn this around?
This is the optimist in me. I don't think it's ever too late. You know, there's always a way. There's always a way for us to reach back and make that commitment. There's always an opportunity. To every crisis, there's an opportunity. This is a big crisis we're in. It's just not a bad legislature or an inattentive governor, if people think that, or courts that are off the wall. It's the whole system. It's the weight of the whole system. And the more people realize that, and the more they're willing to take it on, whether it's in small bits or large pieces, the better off we're going to be. No, it's never too late. It's never too late, and this could be the first day of a new start.
Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us and for all the work you've done. And
thank you.
Thank you all for listening. We look forward to bringing you the next conversation with a California forward thinker.